Dear colleagues, students, and friends in Cyprus, Greece, and around the world, welcome to the fifth education webinar of the Distinguished Speakers webinar series on special and inclusive education. My name is Lefki Kourea, an assistant professor of special and inclusive education, and I have the great pleasure to coordinate today's webinar. The free webinar is organized by the Department of Education of the University of Nicosia. It aims to connect education communities with experts on topics around empirically based research-based educational practices and new methodologies for improving the quality of life of students with disabilities and their families. These webinars provide an opportunity to interact with leading scholars whose research has significantly impacted the field of education over the years. We can discuss with our speakers synchronously via YouTube and Facebook chat. I strongly encourage you to pose your questions and comments in the chat box, either in English or in Greek, and I will address them to today's speakers at the end of the presentation. Now, I'm honored to present you today's speaker, Professor Rob Horner from the United States. We thank him for accepting this invitation and sharing his rich experience and deep knowledge around behavioral issues in school context. Professor Horner is an emeritus professor of special education at the University of Oregon and a prominent scholar in applied behavior analysis, positive behavior support, multi-tier instructional systems, and systems change approach. Dr. Horner has worked with other leading researchers for over 2 decades in the development and implementation of school-based positive behavioral interventions and supports known as PBIS. As of today, over 30,000 American schools and more than 20 countries across the world have been culturally adapting and implementing the core features of the PBIS framework in their national context, including Cyprus. Professor Horner has authored and co-authored numerous papers and received multiple awards, with the latest one being the 2020 Association of Positive Behavior Support Leadership Award. Professor Horner's presentation focuses on school-wide positive behavior support, an introduction to core features and documented outcomes. Emphasis will be placed on the value and implementation process on building a positive, proactive, consistent, and safe school-wide social culture that brings academic and social success for all students. The webinar presentation will address the core features of the PBIS framework, how it is being adopted by schools, the importance of adapting PBIS to fit local culture norms, and research assessing the impact of PBIS. Professor Horner, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Lefki, that was very kind, and I am delighted to be here. I have had the opportunity to look at some of the other webinars, and I'm very impressed with the sequence of topics and the depth with which you all are focusing both on special education and inclusive efforts. And I'm especially pleased to be able to talk this morning or afternoon, in your case, about school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports. And I'm hoping that we will have enough time at the end to really deal more carefully with some of the questions and some of the challenges, because if you've already been doing, those of you who have already been doing PBIS, I'm very interested in the experiences, the challenges, and the successes that you've had. So let's delve into this. The goal today will be to, one, define school-wide positive behavior supports. I want to make sure that everybody's clear about what those are, what the core features are. By the end of this webinar, you should be able to tell if a school you walk into is actually implementing at least Tier 1 PBIS. Let's talk about the outcomes, because the outcomes for not just for the students, but for the faculty and the families are really the reason why I hope you get excited about looking at implementing PBIS. And then I want to make sure that we have time. So we talk about the questions that lead to how PBIS becomes more than a way of decreasing problem behavior, but really a strategy for promoting the overall social, emotional, and behavioral development of your students. Okay, I'm making some assumptions. One of the assumptions is that based on the background that I've been given, many of you are actually quite experienced with PBIS, but I'm also assuming that at least some people who are listening are new to the idea of using positive behavior interventions and supports as a framework for supporting child behavior. We'll share the fact that all of us have a common commitment to the social and emotional development of children in the schools, and that everybody on this webinar brings unique experiences that allow them to be successful. We want to use those unique and cultural experiences to make sure that PBIS is actually implemented well. I also really want to follow up with a comment that Lefke made about this work, this body of work related to PBIS being developed by a large network of people. Most importantly, Dr. George Sugai at the University of Connecticut and his staff and colleagues, now continuing on with Dr. Brandy Simonson, Tim Lewis in Missouri, Lucille Eber in Illinois, and Don Kincaid and Heather George in South Florida. So the message I want to give is that there really has been a large group of people who have been actively engaged in developing and implementing and testing positive behavior support. Okay, so here you go. The first thing I promised is that we would define what is PBIS, so that you really have a sense that we're talking about something that you can get your ideas around. PBIS is not a set of rules that define what everybody does. PBIS is a framework. It's a multi-tiered framework. It's used differently with all students versus those students who need a little more versus those students who need a lot of support. It's a framework designed to establish the social culture of a school, the way that students actually not just interact with adults, but the way that the students interact with each other is a very critical variable in terms of the success of their education. And PBIS is a network and system of behavioral supports. But the thing that I really want you to come back to is it's a way to establish the social culture and behavior supports so that all students, and this is important given the emphasis in these webinars are on inclusive education, all students achieve academic and behavioral success. Now, if you look at the features of PBIS that would be a little different than what we often see in schools, it starts like this. Of all the big messages that I want you to take away, listen to this one. The way to decrease problem behavior is not just by focusing on what you do when a student behaves inappropriately, but by what we do as adults before they start behaving inappropriately. So one of the greatest values and most important contributions of PBIS is the emphasis on prevention, on what you do before the students actually develop problem behavior categories or problem behavior patterns. One of the ways that we do this is I want you to think about defining and teaching the social expectations of your school. Too often, especially in the United States, we assume that students will arrive at school with appropriate social behaviors, and we're shocked and disappointed when they show up with behaviors related to aggression or noncompliance or disruption. So one of the things that we've learned, start every school year by teaching all the students in the school the school-wide expectations, not the rule of things what not to do. Don't focus on don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, but actually focus on 3 to 5 key social expectations, the values that really are going to drive the social behavior in your school. Things like be responsible, be respectful, be kind to each other. Make it fit the social culture of the school, but make it clear that it's a set of expectations that all students will be responding to. Now, most of you are experienced and accomplished teachers, and you know that we never teach something without systematically and repeatedly acknowledging students when they do it the right way. Remember that providing positive feedback is a core part of good teaching. We also, however, need to have clear consequences when students do things that are inappropriate, because you don't want inappropriate behavior to be inadvertently rewarded by other students or rewarded by escaping demands. So define what you want, teach what you want, acknowledge what you are seeing that's positive, and then build in what we call corrective consequences for students when they behave inappropriately. Now, PBIS also has as one of the key features the collection and use of data for decision making, because every school is going to be different and every school will need to adjust or adapt PBIS in small ways, or in some cases large ways, to make it fit the community and the culture of that school. The way you do that is not by just sitting and thinking. It's by actually using the data from the students' behavior. What do they do? Where do they do it? When do they do it? Why do they keep doing it? Collecting and using data on a regular basis, not once a year, is a core feature of PBIS. Now, perhaps one of the most distinctive pieces is this whole notion of a continuum or a multi-tiered framework. So the other thing that we've really learned is too often when we think about addressing problem behavior in schools, we only think about that small group of students who really create high intensive problems and challenges. I keep always thinking when I was a teacher in California, I had to periodically acknowledge that the students who were most disruptive and most challenging were those from whom I learned the most about how to teach well. So we often focus on those students. But PBIS has taught us, remember that emphasis on prevention? Always start with all students. Assume that every student in the building requires some level of behavior support. And if we start with all and we build a good foundation, adding the additional supports for those students in the tier 2, the yellow part of the triangle, or tier 3, the red part of the triangle, those students will be much more responsive. The other piece that I want to bring in, and I'm hoping that some of you who are listening are building principals or district or national administrators. One of the messages that is really critical for PBIS is you never implement classroom and student practices without also implementing the organizational systems that allow those practices to be effective. The focus on policies, the emphasis on the value of social behavior in addition to academic behavior, the development of teams of teachers and administrators who work collectively, the data that people have. Those are the systems that allow students to succeed when PBIS is implemented. Okay, so let's be really clear. The fundamental purpose of PBIS, the thing that makes it exciting and useful to us, is the development of a school-wide social culture. a culture that helps the school to be more effective, more efficient, and more equitable. So when you look at saying, are we doing PBIS and is it being successful, you should be able to identify problem behaviors are decreasing, academic competence is increasing. The effort on the part of teachers and administrators and families is lower. It gets more efficient, not more difficult. And it's a strategy that is designed to adjust to fit all students. So if we do that well, what are the four pieces that we've learned? We've learned that if you want to build an effective social culture, there are four things to really look at. Create a school environment in which the appropriate behavior is highly predictable. So think about the extent to which your students clearly understand what is expected of them. So make an environment that is predictable. Make an environment that is easy for students to identify how to succeed. But also do this, and this, quite frankly, is a tough thing to do. Make it consistent across people, across places, and across time. Make the environment consistent so that going from one classroom to another classroom, to the hallway, to the cafeteria, to the playground, there's consistency in what the expectations are. When we make expectations too complicated and too hidden for the students who are coming from highly nurtured backgrounds do fine. But the students who come from backgrounds that are less consistent and less stable, students who have lower academic and language skills, those students will suffer. If you want to create an environment, a school environment that is really equitable, part of what you want to look at is building something that makes it easy for students to identify what is expected across the environment. The other part that we've learned is too often when people think about school discipline, they only think about negative consequences for problem behavior. And there need to be consequences for problem behavior. But one of the things that we've learned, students respond better when the environment is positive. As a general rule, we look for children in elementary school, for example, to receive at least 4 positive comments about their behavior for every correction. They want an environment that is clearly they've been taught what to expect, they understand how to be successful, and when they are making an effort to behave well, people acknowledge that. They say, yes, you're doing a good job, and this is what you've done well. The other piece is we've got to create environments that are safe. And especially in the United States, we have far too many schools that are in situations where the children do not feel that they are personally in safe settings. We want to make sure that the students understand that the adults are looking out for them, that the physical space is safe and consistent. So if you want to create a positive social environment, an environment that will both promote positive behavior and promote academic success, create a school environment that is predictable, that is consistent, that is positive, and that is safe. Establishing a positive social culture is something that is critical. And it's critical first and foremost for creating that sense of security and safety. But it also is going to be related to academic outcomes. And I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. Okay, now one of the other parts that I want you to think about, and this is, I'm trying to do 2 things. One is to indicate the elements and the complexity of PBIS, but also to break it apart so that it seems accessible. I want you to be thinking about, I could do this, I can do this, someone else or a team of people will need to do that. So here's a way to think about how and why PBIS works. PBIS always starts, and this is important for when we think about building PBIS across cultures with equity and with cultural responsivity. We always start with the outcomes, never start with the problems, always start with the outcomes. We want to build social competence and we want to build academic achievement. The practices of PBIS, the things I'm going to talk about in just a little bit, are the things that change student behavior. It's those practices that fall into this continuum of tier 1, the green, all of the students, tier 2, the yellow, some of the students, and the tier 3, red, that small 3 to 5% of students who have really intense patterns of problem behavior. Start with the outcomes, then focus on the practices that help students. But PBIS recognizes the systems that primarily support those of us who are adults within the building. What are the policies, the staffing patterns, the meeting protocols, the team structures that work? Far too often, we in the United States have left teachers by themselves trying to solve behavior problems. In schools that implement PBIS, the adults, the teachers, feel as supported as the students. This is a strategy focused on building the systems that allow the adults to be effective. A key part of that is focusing on the data for making decisions. So think of PBIS as always focusing on the outcomes, but incorporating practices, systems, and consistent use of data. If we do that well, we can create schools that work for all students. We can build schools that have equity. Now, as Lefkin indicated at the beginning, we have been doing PBIS for over 2 decades, and we have been implementing it primarily throughout the United States. There are over 30,000 schools in the United States using PBIS, and that amounts to about a third of all the schools in the US. All 50 states are using it, and that amounts to, I want you to think about this, there are over 15 million children in the United States who are currently participating in schools implementing PBIS. And in the past about 12 years, we really have been focusing on implementing PBIS, not just in the United States, but internationally. And there are 21 countries that have been formally set up and are implementing PBIS. And we're very excited and impressed at the work that you all in Cyprus have been doing. We're interested especially in the ways that people in other countries are adapting PBIS to make it fit their culture, their communities, their language systems, their families. And we're very excited. There's been recent research that's been done, especially in Denmark and Norway, focusing on how to make school-wide positive behavior support fit local and different cultures. All right, so I told you that one of the things that I would do would be to focus on the outcomes. And oftentimes when people are considering the choice about whether to invest in implementing PBIS, you want to say, well, what are we going to get? I mean, what will really happen? So one of the really exciting things, one of the reasons why this topic is part of your webinar series is because we have done the research looking at whether this works. This is not just a good idea. It's actually something that has been systematically studied. Here are a set of different peer-reviewed publications that suggest that if you implement PBIS well, if you do it with fidelity, you'll see a 20 to 60% reduction in problem behavior. Now think about that. Those of you who are classroom teachers, think about the amount of time, energy, frustration, and school resource that you invest in dealing with problem behavior. Think about reducing that by 20 to 60%. If you implement PBIS within 1 year and you do it well, you'll see a 20 to 60% reduction in problem behavior. But that's not just what happens. The part of the reason, remember that focus on prevention? It comes by enabling, enhancing, empowering positive behavior. So part of what we've found in several studies is not just that there's a decrease in problems, but there's an increase in how well students interact with each other. Catherine Bradshaw demonstrated that students in schools implementing positive behavior support improve social emotional regulation. We also, and I emphasize this, that PBIS really is always invested in improving the academic achievement of children. But let's be clear, we're not naive enough to believe that by teaching being respectful and responsible, students will learn math and reading and language. What happens is when you build a school with strong positive behavior interventions and supports, positive PBIS, what happens is, one, students are more likely to come to school. Two, they're more likely to pay attention in class. Three, because of the reduction in problem behavior, teachers actually spend more time teaching as opposed to managing students. It is because they come, they pay attention, and more time is spent in instruction that we see increases in academic achievement. So the link, the connection, the synergy, the combining of academic and behavior supports is something that we have been especially excited about. Now, research also suggests that when you implement PBIS, students say the school is a safer place to be, and teachers say that it's a more effective place to teach. We're very excited by research that shows that when teachers are asked, how effective are you at being a teacher? How successful do you think you are at being a teacher? Schools that implement PBIS show higher teacher sense of efficacy than schools that do not. And part of that really reduces the staff turnover. Those of you who are in administrative positions, one of your great challenges is that every year you have teachers, even principals, moving from one school to another or leaving. Part of what we see, and staff turnover is always a disruption. It's a disruption for the children and for the families as well as for the school itself. Part of what we see when you implement PBIS is a reduction in staff turnover. You see teachers, administrators, school psychologists, counselors, social workers working collaboratively. And the success of working together promotes people staying. Successful teachers are less likely to be teachers who leave. All right. Now, if you're going to teach, if you're going to actually build a positive social culture, how do you do that? What does that really mean? I mean, I have to confess, my wife was trained as an anthropologist, and she is very careful about how she uses the word culture. The culture that people are in is defined by so many different people in so many different ways. So let me be really clear. When I talk about building a positive social culture, I'm talking about building an environment in which the children in the school see themselves not just as isolated learners, but as linked people who are part of an ongoing common effort. And the way you build membership in a culture, the way you make a school a place that students feel belonging to, is three things. One, I want you to build a common language about social behavior. That doesn't mean everybody speaks English or everybody speaks Greek. It means everybody knows what the expectations are. Be respectful, be responsible, be kind, try your best. Whatever those expectations are, all of the students know the words. They can tell you what the words are. But more than that, and this is really important, they know what it means. So when you say, what are the expectations here, young lady? And your fifth grade student says, be respectful, part of what you can say is, well, tell me what being respectful means right here. So in the classroom, what does it mean to be respectful? And she'll say, well, it means raising your hand before you talk. It means following instructions when the teacher is giving you instructions. What does being responsible mean? What does being kind mean on the playground? So not only do they know the words, but they know what they mean. But here's the third part. If you want to build a social culture, build an environment where not only do the students know what the expectations are, but they know that everyone else in the school also knows. So that's why when you teach at the beginning of each year a small set of behavioral expectations, you know that probably 2/3 of the children in your school, if not more, already know essentially what being respectful and responsible are. But by going through the teaching, they see that everybody else knows. When the students have a common set of words, they all know what they mean, and they have all gone through an experience of instruction together, it changes how the students interact with each other. They will expect appropriate behavior from each other, because good behavior support is not about controlling and managing children. It's about empowering them and with clarity about how to behave well. I want you to think about this. This is one elementary school that has 3 expectations. Be respectful, treat everyone courteously and with kindness. Be responsible, do the right thing. Have pride in your own behavior, which they use to mean try hard. So this is one school's example. And those of you who are in middle schools or high schools, we do the same thing. The difference is we allow the high school students to be much more engaged in the selection of what their expectations are. This is a hallway in a high school in Louisiana. And the high school students with the staff selected 3 expectations. We want to focus on responsibility, on respect, and on positive relationships. Now, the students built this image on the hallway, which makes it very difficult to see, but it was theirs. And because they were part of selecting it, those students in that high school were very good at being clear about what those expectations are. So let's do this. Let me ask you a hypothetical. So tomorrow, when you go to school, consider doing this. Take 3 to 5 students, different students, not a group of students, but 3 to 5, and stop them and just say, do you know what the behavioral expectations are in the school? Do you know what the expectations are? And for little kids, for kids in first grade or second grade, we would say, do you know what the 3 B's are? Or do you know what in the example I just showed you, what the 3 keys are in the Wyndham School? But do you know what the expectations are? Can they tell you what is expected? Then say, okay, right here where we're at, if we're in the classroom or the cafeteria or the hallway, can you tell me what does that mean about how you behave? Can they tell you about what it means? And then here's the one I always like best. Ask, has anyone acknowledged you? Has anyone said, hey, you're doing a good job about doing those behavioral expectations? So if you were to ask your students those questions tomorrow, what proportion of your students could tell you the expectations, could tell you what it meant, and would tell you that somebody had acknowledged them for doing things right in the past 2 weeks, for example? In schools that do PBIS well, 90% of the students can answer these 3 questions. I was in Belgium not too long ago, and in Belgium, they are implementing PBIS. And we were in an elementary school, grades 1 through 5. And I was in a meeting where there was a small group of 5th and 6th graders, and they were working. And I had the opportunity. I asked one young 5th grader, I said, do you know the expectations? And she told me the expectations. And I said, do you know what it means here? And she told me what it means. And I asked her, I said, now, has anybody acknowledged you for doing things right in the past week? And she thought for a minute and she said, no, they hadn't. And I said, well, what do you think we should do? And she said, I think you should give me your ticket to go back to America. I said, well, that's an idea, but we probably aren't going to do that. So part of what I want you to think about, ask yourself this question. If you were to, in your school, stop 3 to 5 students and ask each one of them those questions, could they answer them? If they can, then in our experience, you've created a positive social culture. You've created a social culture where the kids are going to succeed. If you haven't, I want you to think about what you could do that would make a difference. And here are the things that we're learning. This is a picture of Dr. George Sugai. And George is one of the key people who has championed the key messages around PBIS. He taught us that the social culture of a school makes a big difference on whether the school is effective, efficient, and equitable. George taught us that if we're going to do good education, we need to think about behavior support as something that happens with the whole school, in addition to those things that happen for those kids who need it most. He taught us that too often we load the tasks of behavior support on the backs of teachers who already are carrying too large a load. We need to do PBIS in a way that is practical, not harder to do, but easier to do than not doing it. So if we do PBIS well, we do it with the systems that make it an efficient and effective process for teachers. And always we keep focusing on the idea that there isn't just one strategy that works for everybody. You start with prevention by, before anybody's even had a chance to make a mistake, define, teach, monitor, and acknowledge behavioral expectations. But be aware there are some students that are going to need more intensive support, and build the tier 2 and tier 3 pieces that make that work. Doing this tiered system of support has been a core feature of PBIS for at least the past 20 years. We borrowed this from research that was done in community health. But you'll see in the literature on PBIS, this notion of multiple tiers presented many different ways. And I want to be clear about how this works. PBIS always starts with the triangle looking like this. This is representative of all the students in the school. All the students receive the initial tier 1 instruction, support, and ongoing acknowledgement. Our experience is about 80% of students will be successful with that small amount of support. And that will save you having to do more intense support with a lot of other students. There will be about 10 to 15% of students who don't need high intensity support, but they need a little bit of additional work, often around variables related to self-regulation, work that Tom DeShawn did, focusing on self-regulatory strategies for children in elementary, middle, and high school is especially relevant in this regard. We also, most of us who have been working in PBIS were ourselves teachers, and we know that there's always a small group of students who keep us humble. They are the ones whose behavior is most challenging and most intense. What we've learned, for those students, we must individualize support. We must adjust to their unique positions and experiences. So PBIS is a set of 3 different sets of supports that increase in intensity. The point is that you don't do high intensity for everyone, and that if you do it well, if you focus on prevention first, if the first thing that you do is focus on prevention, then you will decrease the number of students who you then have to deal with high intensity supports. So focus on prevention first, have multiple tiers of support, and move students early into the tier 2 and tier 3 supports. In the United States, we start school at the end of August, the beginning of September. We expect students to be moving in to tier 3 and tier 2 supports by mid-October. So part of what we're learning is not to wait too long, but to intervene. So you see this notion of the multiple tiers being a critical feature. One thing that has been a problem for us, however, is sometimes people think about the children being the tiers. Don't do that. It's not that the children are tiers, it's that the level of support is in the tiers. So, for example, don't use PBIS multiple tiers as a diagnostic tool. If you think about this one child, so here he is. He may need only tier 1 support to do reading well. He may need tier 2 support to do behavior well. He may need tier 3 support to do math well, but in social and emotional health, he's doing fine. So it would be inappropriate to label this child as a tier 2 student or a tier 3 student. The tiers refer to the level of intensity of support, not to a particular child. Now, I promised you that one of the things I would do is, one, I define PBIS, I talk about what the outcomes were, but I would also leave you with clear idea about the critical features. So if you were thinking about doing PBIS in your school, what would it look like? What would you see? Let's just take tier 1, the green part of the triangle. So if we did tier 1, if you were doing that at your school, you would have a leadership team, a group of 3 to 5 to 7 teachers, administrators, related services people, special educators, people in your school whose job it was to lead implementation and adaptation of PBIS. Those people would have regular access to meetings and staff time. You would also have a small set of school-wide expectations. All the students would be taught school-wide expectations, typically at the beginning of the year, but again throughout the year. You'd have ways of acknowledging students for doing things right. And when we look at acknowledgement, it wouldn't just be individual students being acknowledged. It would be whole classrooms of students who were doing things well. We'd have different ways of letting the students know that we appreciated their efforts to behave well. Acknowledge both individual student behavior and acknowledge group behavior. There would be clear consequences for problem behavior, but the consequences would not focus on punishing what we didn't like. But when a student behaved incorrectly, we'd use what we call an instructional correction. You interrupt the problem behavior, you redirect them to the behavior that you know that they're supposed to be doing. So you'd say, stop. That's not being respectful. What would be the respectful way to behave? You avoid rewarding problem behavior by allowing the student to get attention or to get out of difficulty. And you connect the student with consequences that are culturally appropriate. Often, how do you restore a setting or a situation after an instance of problem behavior? We also focus very, very much on classroom systems. And there's a manual that you can download on pbis.org that actually talks about the classroom systems. One of the things that I'm especially pleased by is the focus on teaching classroom routines. If you're a teacher, think about what are the 3 to 5 routines that are most important that you need to not just assume, but to teach. How do you deal with the routine, for example, of coming into the class at the beginning of the day, after lunch, after recess, after something? How do you deal with the routine of shifting from small group instruction to whole group instruction to individual instruction? How do you deal with the routine of requesting help if you as a student have difficulties? So it's not just a set of expectations, but how do you actively teach students to be successful? The collection and use of data. So do you know in your school the rate of problem behavior? Do you send students to the office? Do you have office referrals when they behave badly? And if you do, how many of those are happening in your school every week? Who are the students who are most likely to do it? What are the behaviors and what are the situations where problems are most likely? Focus on the extent to which student behavior is predictable and consistent, and look at ways that we can modify the environment. Remember that problem behavior is not inside the student as much as it's a student context interaction. If you want to improve student behavior, change the context that they are behaving in. The other thing that we ask over and over again is that a team measure if they're actually implementing the elements of PBIS, both at Tier 1 and at Tier 2 and at Tier 3. Part of PBIS also focuses on bully prevention. Most schools will have a small set of students who use their social or physical power to control other students. Don't let that happen. Part of what you need to do is to teach all students how to respond if someone else is not being respectful, not being responsible. So if someone else is not being respectful to you, you tell them to stop. You actually recruit teacher assistants. Part of what we have found, bullying behavior occurs and is maintained primarily by the social feedback that students get from peers or bystanders. Reducing bullying is more than teaching appropriate behavior and telling students to not engage in bullying. It also involves removing the social payoff that students get for engaging in bullying behavior. And we have a whole program focused on that again, you can download off of PBIS. The last element of Tier 1 PBIS is family engagement or family cooperation, collaboration, participation. And again, we have a whole set of materials that you can download for including families in their active engagement when their children come to school. So if you were in a school that was saying, we are using PBIS, you will have schools in Cyprus saying we're using PBIS. Ask them, do you have a leadership team? Do you have a small set of expectations? Do you have a formal set of strategies for acknowledging appropriate behavior? Are there consequences that are not just punitive, but are instructional, that guide students back to using appropriate behavior? Are you using classroom systems that include classroom expectations with systematic routines that students have been taught, with a high rate of student opportunity to respond and praise for students? Can you, as a faculty in your school, talk about the data describing what students do, where, when, and why? Do you also have some way of measuring if you're doing PBIS and moving to improve not just Tier 1, but Tiers 2 and 3? Have you taught the students, all students, not just what the expectations are, but how to deal with the behavior of some other student who does not behave well? Teach students how to respond to the inappropriate behavior of peers. That's part of decreasing bullying. And do you have a way of actively engaging families? Often what I ask is, if I talk to the families in your school, do they know how to participate and assist and accompany the educational opportunities that make their child more successful? These are the core elements of Tier 1 PBIS. Now, some common questions that I get. One is, well, how long does it take to implement PBIS? The answer is it typically takes about a year to get Tier 1 in place, and then it takes more time to get Tier 2 and 3. A lot depends on what you're already doing well. If you already have basic elements and good systems in place, you can implement PBIS much more quickly. In school districts or in smaller countries that are implementing PBIS, after they have a small set of 15 or 20 schools doing PBIS, the development and the adoption of PBIS by additional schools is faster because they have examples of how to do it. Another question is, I'd like to do this, I'd like to do it, but you're talking about all of the adults in the building being part of this process. How do you get buy-in from the faculty to really make this happen? Well, here's the answer. Okay, first off, don't implement PBIS unless there's a common agreement that the social behavior of students needs to improve. If all of the students in your school are behaving very well, you are already doing the key things. We're very impressed. You don't need to adopt PBIS just because somebody else did. But ask the question. When I go to schools, I ask teachers to raise their hand if they believe that the children in their classrooms are behaving just fine. If they are perfectly happy with the behavior of their children, investing in implementing PBIS is not probably the smallest change that'll make the biggest difference, biggest benefit for children. It's very unusual, though. Most teachers say, yes, we need to improve the social behavior of the children in my class. If they do that, then build a team and have the team operate with 4 rules. Rule 1, never stop doing what already works. So don't ask people to stop doing things that are already being successful. Second, agree that you will only do things that have actually been proven empirically, scientifically, with evidence. So we don't do things just because we read it on the internet. We only do things that actually have evidence that it benefits and helps children. Third, adopt the smallest change that'll make the biggest benefit for kids. So if you always retain the good things you're already doing, say, what would be the smallest difference? If you already have a small set of behavioral expectations, but you don't have a core system of acknowledging those, then look at that. If you've got expectations and you've got a way for acknowledging, ask yourself, have we also taught the students what to do if someone else is rude or threatening? So under those conditions, think about the smallest change that'll make the biggest difference. And then one of the things that I learned, given that my father was a school administrator, is don't have new things become a heavy burden for the teachers. Never add something new unless you identify what you will stop doing to create the resources so that they can implement it, not just in name, but really well. Implement a smaller number of things with high quality rather than implementing everything you can find. Another question that I often get is, well, wait a minute. We are always sort of dealing with behavioral crises. We've got students fighting. We've got students running away. We have students in tears and emotionally just devastated. How are we to do PBIS when we're continually responding to behavioral crises? And this is something that we see over and over and over again. So one of the messages, dealing with Tier 3 supports is part of PBIS, but it is not everything. The thing that we have learned is that unless you start with prevention, you will always be dealing with crises. Start by building a school-wide system that decreases the number of crises. Then add to that the key features from special education, counselors, social workers to deal with the additional intense issues. Work by Jeff Colvin has been especially helpful to us in terms of looking at de-escalation and crisis response strategies. Okay, so important. I want you to be thinking about how you would adopt PBIS. And one of the things that I want you to take away is that if we do this well, we're going to be implementing not just the name, but really doing it. Sometimes we do things without doing them as intended. In one school, for example, they had, this is an elementary school, and they had 3 expectations: be safe, be kind, be responsible. But when you actually looked at what the teachers were doing, their actual rules was don't have gum, don't have hats, don't have backpacks, don't do running, don't do violence. They focused on the don'ts, not on what the do was. So they were not doing what they were expecting others to do. This is an example of a school in Hawaii, and they used PBIS and they made it fit their culture. The way it was set up, the images, and the selection of how they described it, both in English and in Hawaiian. I am safe, I am kind, I am responsible. So in part, if we do this well, if we make it actually fit what you're doing, then part of what you're going to find is implementing PBIS becomes more effective and efficient. Start by defining the purpose, not the strategy. So the purpose is to implement a school-wide culture that improves social competence, decreases problem behavior, and makes the school a more effective educational setting. Do things that are evidence-based and that are doable. Make it fit. One of the things we've done is we've built this idea of measuring PBIS. So there's a tool called the Tiered Fidelity Inventory. If you are implementing PBIS, use this tool. It has a set of questions that you ask that say, are we doing the elements of PBIS? And for those of you who are statisticians and researchers, this tool has been assessed to have good content validity, usability, inter-rater agreement. So this is something that is not just developed once, but has been used over a long period of time. The TFI, the Tiered Fidelity Inventory, shows you the extent to which you are implementing the elements of PBIS at Tier 1, at Tier 2, and at Tier 3. Here's a school. Look at the dark green colors. At Tier 1, they were doing about 1/3 of the elements when we first measured. With Tier 2, also about 1/3. With Tier 3, they were doing more Tier 3 than they were Tier 1 or Tier 2. But after engaging in 1 year of implementing PBIS, they had met the 70% criteria where we get change in kid behavior. If you implement PBIS with at least 70% fidelity, you will get change in how students behave. So it's a way of measuring what you do. Here, for example, are some of the items. Do you have a team? Do you have behavioral expectations? Did you teach the expectations? And if you give yourself a score of 0, 1, or 2, 0 meaning no, 2 meaning completely, 1 meaning sort of, partially, then you come up with an action plan that says, if we aren't teaching expectations, what will we do? Who will do it? And by when will it get done? The action planning process is very helpful for building and implementing PBIS. This is a graph of the number of schools in different states throughout the United States. So if you look at California, which has the largest population, there were over 2,700 schools implementing PBIS. Of those, 2,400 were measuring fidelity, and 1,500 were actually implementing Tier 1 PBIS at fidelity. Others were in their first year of adoption and had not yet got all of the pieces in place. The interesting thing is we have over 16,000 schools measuring if they're doing PBIS on a regular basis. So this is not something that is just done by a small group or only for research. This is something that a team can do within an hour to determine if they are implementing. And they can, once they've done it the first time, they can come back and repeat that within 15 minutes. Within 15 minutes, we can tell if you're implementing Tier 1 PBIS. And then not just do that as an assessment, but do it to guide and improve implementation. All right. I want to end by really focusing on the need to attend to the culture of your community and your school. We have been particularly interested in the issue of implementing PBIS in a way that makes schools effective for all students, the issue of equity. We've also been especially focused on adapting PBIS so it fits the different cultures that schools present across your country. In the United States, we learned very quickly that schools in inner city Chicago or New York or Los Angeles were different in the way that they operated from the schools in rural New Mexico that primarily were serving children coming from the Native American communities, or students in rural Georgia or Louisiana that were in far less condensed environments. We understand that the social culture needs to be not something that's the same everywhere, but that fits what you're doing. So we actually have guides to help people walk through the social culture. Let me give you one example. There's one example I especially like that a scholar, Manuel Monsalve, who's a professor of special education at the University of Tulca in Chile. And he was working with us and was especially interested in adapting Tier 3 behavior support to the culture, to the contextual fit of how teachers and administrators and families were operating. And one of the things that Manuel did is he said, when we implement behavior support, it needs to fit the values, the skills, the administrative social resources that are available, and it needs to be done with administrative support. Implementing PBIS involves paying attention to values, skills, and resources and administrative support as much as paying attention to those core practices that I described earlier. One of the things that Manuel did is he went into 4 different schools, and in each school, he identified a teacher who was implementing PBIS. And we had observers go in and look at the extent to which that teacher's classroom was actually implementing the elements. Were there behavioral expectations? Were there routines? Were there practices that were being set up reasonably? The bars here, this is in baseline for each of 4 teachers, show that teacher 1 was not doing PBIS. Teacher 2 was doing some things, but sporadically. Sometimes she would do it, sometimes she wouldn't. Teacher 3 started off not, but then was doing some things. Teacher 4 was doing more, but we really only doing about a third. So even though these teachers had been taught the elements of PBIS, they were not implementing them. So what Manuel did is he said, let's look at the plan you have. To what extent is the plan consistent with what you value? Are we focusing on the things you think are most important? To what extent do you actually understand how to do some of the things that have been described? Teacher 2, for example, was using a strategy called pre-correction. So just before a difficult situation would arise, difficult for her students was a transition, going to the cafeteria, going to recess, shifting from a whole group to small group instruction. When those shifts happened, her students had difficulty. So pre-correction was reviewing with them what we had learned. Okay, it's time to go down to the cafeteria. How do we line up? What do we do going down? How do we be quiet in the hallway? So by doing a quick review, that pre-correction was effective. Now, she knew that she was supposed to do that, but she didn't quite understand how to make it work in her class. So she had the knowledge, but not the skill. Manuel taught her the skill. This is how it works in your classroom. Now, I want you to look at what happened. When he implemented not new practices, but the values, skills, and resources, look at the change that these teachers had in the extent to which they were implementing those behavior supports. The teachers became much better. Implementing PBIS with cultural and contextual fit is directly related to whether it's done well. Now, here's the behavior of students. This is the rate of problem behavior, the proportion of intervals that we watched in which children were behaving badly. So 70%, 50%, 40%, 45%, lots of problem behavior. When the teachers implemented things well, look at the reduction in problem behavior. So part of the message, attending to social culture is important for implementing PBIS. And it's not just if you say you're doing it, but if you're implementing it well, that produces change. So here's the end. Here's what I want you to take away. You've been very patient letting me talk far too long. PBIS starts with values about how schools operate and children are successful. It adds the science of human behavior to talk about how we can best create schools that are successful for children. And it uses the technology of implementation science to make what we know works actually possible for children. If we do that well, we get a package that we call positive behavior support. It's effective. It works to reduce problem behavior and increase appropriate behavior. It's efficient in the extent that regular teachers can do this. It's practical, it's durable, it's possible. And most importantly, it's equitable. PBIS is one of the ways that you can make your school successful, especially for those students who have the greatest challenges. It's a way of starting with all children, of incorporating families, of looking at ways in which you build on what you are already doing well. And when you do that successfully, you see environments in which children are actively engaged, excited to be in school, and are actually building social development as well as academic success. Thank you. Now, let's shift to how I can be most helpful in responding to how PBIS might fit best for your schools.
Professor Horner, thanks much for the stimulating and insightful presentation and the very clear practical messages you shared with us on how we build and contextually fit the core features of the PBIS to support the needs of our students. Yes, we are now moving to our discussion part. I have gathered a list of questions from our audience, as well as from our collective experience working with schools implementing the PBIS framework over the last 7 years in Cyprus. The questions are grouped across 4 themes. theory and philosophy of PBIS, staff buy-in, implementation, and effectiveness. Let's start with the theoretical aspects concerning the PBIS. The first question is related to this notion of putting policy and practice efforts in inclusive education. Would you consider the SW-PBIS framework as an applied example of inclusive education?
Yes. The people who have developed PBIS all came out of the philosophy and the strategies related to inclusion. Schools only become successful elements in their settings if they are providing the level of support that's necessary for all students in their communities. So the interesting thing is schools started off with, we're going to have an environment that works for some children, and for children for whom it doesn't work, we'll send them somewhere else. The somewhere else has never developed. And in the United States, it has not developed. In other countries, it has not developed. We need schools that all families can feel fit for their child. And that's a fine goal. The challenge is too often families feel that if they send their child to a school using inclusive practices, the resources in that school will go to the students who are in most need and not to others. With PBIS, part of what we've done is we've said, here's the way in which you can use resources efficiently to address all students. We focused primarily on students needing social, emotional, and behavioral support, but we were all trained to also focus on math, reading, and academic supports as well. And in Michigan, in Oregon, in Illinois, we have different states that have organized with strong commitments to inclusion. And part of that has involved incorporating PBIS as a core piece of an inclusive effort.
So along the lines of inclusive education, there is one question coming from the chat that asks, what is the difference between PBIS and special education?
PBIS is not special education, but PBIS incorporates special education. Think of special education not as a different entity, but as a increased level of intensity. So let's call special education are the things that we do in addition to the basic education we give to everyone. So I would say PBIS starts by saying everyone gets the basic strategies and supports. And our experience is 80% of students will be successful with those basic supports. But we don't just stop there. The thing that makes PBIS linked to special education is when you add Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports. The basic message, if you believe in inclusion, you believe in the value and importance of every child. And if you hold that as a value, then the issue is not, are we going to do some different thing? It's what are we going to do where we learn what this little girl needs or what this young man needs so that they can also be successful. That's the real element. I mean, I am a professor of special education. And part of what I know is that in many ways, special education incorporates the core features that make education most effective for everyone.
Moving on to the second topic, the second set of questions related to staff buy-in. One of the questions we often come across when we go out and work with teachers and administrators is this idea of, well, our school does not face any school violence issues. Why should we invest on SWPBIS? And what is your reaction to such comments?
You know, I say it. You focus particularly on violence, and violence is something that always is so challenging. But problem behavior in schools goes well beyond violence. Problem behavior includes noncompliance. Think of problem behavior as all of the behaviors that students do that are a barrier or an obstacle to either academic or social success. If the children in your school are behaving well, then you are already doing something that is wonderful and great. And I would say, don't worry about positive behavior support. You already are succeeding. But I would ask you to measure if you're being successful with everyone. You may be being successful with a small group of students, but in some schools in the United States, there are charter schools in which if a child behaves badly, they expel the child. They make them leave the school. And so they say, we don't have any problem behaviors, so we don't need to implement PBIS. But they are only able to do that because they are excluding those children who need behavior support. We start with two messages. Message number one, implement PBIS because problem behavior will go down and self-regulated positive behavior will go up. But message two is if you implement PBIS well, the children will be more academically engaged, more involved in their studies, and we actually, over a 3-year period, if you implement PBIS in an elementary school at fidelity for 3 years, you will get an increase in the academic outcomes. So the statement of we don't have violence, therefore we don't need PBIS is too narrow. The real question is, do you have behaviors that are a barrier to the academic and social success of your children?
And responding to your last question is that we do, Professor Horner, have school teachers, administrators that they say we have students that they are showing intensive behavioral needs, or even classrooms that they do present a lot of behavior problems, classroom disruptions, not being respectful, not following classroom expectations, and so forth. And that happens with high frequency and intensity. So what we see in the schools is that they allocate most of their resources, time, staff hiring, and money to support that handful of students and those 1 or 2 classrooms in the building. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this in terms of how do we go about and explaining to them the logic of prevention when their focus is on reaction and supporting just those handful students. And when you get into a discussion with them, they refuse to shift their thinking in working proactively with all students.
It is a brilliant question, and I really appreciate that. So think about this. If someone is in pain and you say you need to improve your health, they're not very excited. You've got to take the pain away before people are going to invest in the basic pieces. So the short answer is we actually increase the resources to control the most extreme problem behavior, to build the resources to do tier 1 prevention. We do it only for 3 months. So for 3 months, we're going to add additional personnel to help you with the 10 students who are most difficult. But we will only do that if you establish the school-wide team that allows you to then build behavioral expectations, acknowledgments, and consequence systems. The reason for that, and this is really an important thing that's not as well articulated in the literature. To do tier 3 supports well, you need tier 1 foundation. If you don't have basic school-wide systems in place, it is much more difficult to do tier 3 supports. And the supports that you put in place are less likely to last for a particular student. So I'm completely there. I mean, I come back to the fact that most of us were teachers. We had those experiences. We actually worked. My experience as a special education teacher was working with students with very severe problem behavior. So my appreciation for what those teachers are dealing with is very high. And we do not ever want to see PBIS used as just one more thing that's added to a teacher who is already overwhelmed. That's why you never implement the practices without the organizational systems.
Message is clear. Thank you. Moving on to the third topic of questions related to the implementation aspect. How do we maintain staff buy-in and strengthen our universals when we have a lot of teacher turnover? In Cyprus educational system, school teachers and administrators, they have to relocate every 5-6 years to move to another school. This is not something that they decide, but this is the law that asks them to do so. So when a school implements PBIS and you have at least a third of your staff shifting around, that affects in a way the implementation process. And how do we maintain that momentum of having staff buy-in as well as strengthening our tier 1 universals?
Okay, so there's two different parts to that. First is the staff buy-in. Are the teachers enthused and positive? Teachers will be very willing to invest in implementing PBIS if they have experience of that implementation benefiting both them, their students, and their families. So the best way to get buy-in is to build examples where teachers look at ways in which they can use PBIS. Let me give you an example. In Oregon, which is the state that I am in, at one point, I got a call from the state director of education, and he said, we have teachers now in Oregon, 45% of all schools in Oregon are using PBIS. And he said, we have teachers who will not apply for and work in schools that do not use PBIS because their experience working in schools with PBIS is so much more positive. Now, we have a different system where the teachers get to choose whether they move or not. So part of what you're going to see, teachers will have buy-in to the extent that they see this as something that's practical, that's effective and efficient. Now that's different from your second question, which was, how do we actually do the orientation given that you've got a third of the adults in the school shifting every year? The answer goes like this. Look at the number of schools you've got in Cyprus. You need to get an increased proportion of those schools using PBIS. Second, every year you need to have a time for new teachers to be oriented to the new school. Part of that orientation needs to be, what are the behavioral expectations? What are our acknowledgement systems? How do we do tier 2 supports? Do we use check-in, check-out? Do we use social emotional training? What are the tier 2 pieces? And then how does each teacher identify children needing tier 3 supports and work in tier 3 teams? Now, that's something that you could do in a 1 day or 1.5 days of orientation each year. If you do not do orientation and you just throw teachers into a school, then they are struggling. The best thing that they need to do is they need to be linked with a collaborating teacher. Who is a teacher who's there, who's strong, who can orient them? So there are different strategies that people have used, but what we find is the more schools doing PBIS, the less this becomes an issue. Second, schools regularly building PBIS as part of their annual orientation. And 3, having new teachers paired with an existing teacher who can give them orientation. Different strategies, different things work with different schools.
Great. I'm also looking at the time. We have a few more minutes left, and I do have 2 more questions to ask. I'm also looking at the chat box there. One of the questions coming from the chat is concerning our tier 3 students. What happens if our tier 3 students are not, let me rephrase that, because you also discussed it very clearly in the presentation earlier. We don't label the students according to the tiers. But if our students that they are receiving already tier 3 supports and they're not meeting the behavior expectations, what are the available options for us to support them?
You know, I love that. Simply the fact that you asked that is an example of being committed to those students who are in greatest need. And I appreciate that would be a concern and an interest. There is no one who has implemented tier 3 supports who has not encountered failure. The array of behavioral challenges that students bring is both humbling and encouraging in some ways. So here's the short answer is tier 3 supports are defined by the fact that they are individualized. So you use assessment of the child's skills and needs and challenges to organize the support. It is a difficult task, and anyone who has done it for very long will be just very delighted by their successes and aware of the fact that they won't always get it correct. So the answer is when things are not working, you use that information as new assessment information. You reassemble the team and you say what worked and what didn't work. And oftentimes something will work for a few weeks or a few days and then will stop working. And you'll have to use that information to adjust and adapt. A critical feature of tier 3 supports is the collection and use of data with ongoing adaptation and modification of individualized supports.
Thank you. My last question for today is related to coaching. This comes from, so moving on to the 4th topic of the questions is about teacher coaching. So it is not consistently implemented here in our schools when different ministry initiatives are introduced. And I would like for you to please comment briefly on its research effectiveness within the PBIS framework.
We consider coaching an absolutely essential part of implementation. Our experience is that if you do training without coaching, you will get about 10 to 15% quality implementation. If you do training plus coaching, you'll get 70 to 85% implementation. The effect of coaching increases implementation by 2 to 3 to 4 times. Coaching is incredibly important. I have just finished working with one state where they had very limited resources. They reduced the resources in training so they could increase the resources for coaching. Doing training without coaching is not practical or efficient. So we look at it this way. Training is the set of experiences that allow people to gather new knowledge and skill. Coaching are the things that you do on site to help people use those newly developed skills and knowledge to benefit children. So coaching is only really relevant after teaching, after training, but make coaching really focused on what you're doing. The key things that you do in coaching, don't just give feedback, also do prompting. Good coaches prompt, provide feedback, provide opportunities for fidelity, and they help people adapt new skills to the local culture. 4 things. You prompt teachers, this is the time to use this skill. You give them feedback. This is how you did it well. This is how you could do it better. Don't just say you did it or didn't. Give feedback that will make the skill more precise, more developed. You give people the opportunity to build fluency. So practice doing it so you get good at it. And then you help them adjust so that it fits their school. Is it a small school? Is it a large school? Is it a middle school? Is it an urban school? Each school has its own unique adaptations for how to make things happen. We rely on special educators, administrators, school psychologists, counselors, and social workers to serve as coaches. And we see coaching as an integral and critical part of the implementation process. Look at the work of Dean Fixen, Fixsen, Karen Blasey, Karen Ward, and others as people who have done brilliant work documenting coaching. We actually are submitting a paper for publication next month that is a study of coaching elementary teachers implementing Tier 3 supports and the value that coaching has. So we are very, very clear that implementation of PBIS is done both with active training and with ongoing coaching.
Excellent. And this concludes our discussion for today's webinar, as the time has already passed. And Professor Horner, could you please share some final words of wisdom to all of those teachers, researchers, and ministry stakeholders that have been working tirelessly in creating positive, safe, and consistent school environments?
I think I have given you most of the messages that I have to give. My biggest message would be PBIS is something that was developed by teachers, for teachers, with a focus on making schools more effective learning environments for all children. We can no longer accept the idea that problem behavior is a barrier that prevents children from getting the absolutely essential skills, both social skills and academic skills, that they need to participate in a very complicated and challenging world. PBIS will be one of the pieces that you can use to make your schools more successful and effective. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, please let me share my screen to give some reminders to our audience. So The first reminder is that Professor Horner's webinar has already been recorded and you may access it and the previous ones through our website. Or you can see the website, the webpage on the point number 2 over there. Also a prompt to sign up to receive news and email reminders for our forthcoming webinars. The form for you to register is at the end of the webpage. Our next webinar is coming up on March the 30th with Professor Michael Weimer, and his topic will be inclusive education in a strengths-based era, mapping the future of the field, the exciting topic. And the last prompt is for you to follow our Department of Education's Facebook and Instagram pages with the name unique Department of Education. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you for your active engagement, questions and comments posted in the chat box. Looking forward to having you all in our upcoming webinars of the remaining academic year. Professor Horner, warmest thanks for sharing your tremendous expertise around systems change approach, and wish you all the best of luck and hope to see you again. Thank you.